They locked the doors that night, said their prayers, turned off the lights in a house that had never known fear. By morning, the family that never missed church was gone. No screams heard, no neighbors alerted, just a quiet farmhouse holding a secret too terrible to imagine. How does a family that does everything right become the target of something so wrong? Stay with us, because the truth behind what happened inside that home would shock the entire country. Welcome to Unimaginable True Crimes. Here, we expose the unimaginable, one case at a time. Holcomb, Kansas was the kind of place where doors were rarely locked. A small farming community tucked into the flat expanse of the American Midwest. Wide skies, endless wheat fields, neighbors who knew one another by first name. It was a town built on routine. Church on Sunday, work before sunrise, dinner at the same table every evening. And in the center of that rhythm lived the Clutter family. Herbert Clutter was known as disciplined, organized, and deeply religious. He didn't drink, he didn't gamble. He believed in hard work and prayer. He built his farm into one of the most successful in the area. His wife Bonnie was quieter, struggling with health issues, often confined to her room, but devoted to her children. Nancy Clutter was bright and kind, popular at school, active in church activities. Kenyon Clutter was shy but creative. He loved tinkering, building things in the workshop. On the surface, it was an American portrait of stability, the kind of family you'd trust without question, the kind of family no one would ever suspect could become victims. The Clutter home sat slightly outside town, a large farmhouse surrounded by open land. At night, it was isolated, but isolation didn't feel dangerous in Holcomb. It felt peaceful. There were no reports of crime, no whispers of trouble, no sense of threat. People didn't imagine violence here. They imagined harvest seasons and church socials. And that illusion would make what happened next even more terrifying. November 14th, 1959. It was an ordinary Saturday. Nancy helped a friend bake pies. Kenyon worked on a small project in the basement. Herbert handled farm accounts as he always did. There were no arguments, no raised voices. Neighbors saw nothing unusual. If anything, the day was forgettable. And that's the cruelest part, because tragedy often hides inside normalcy. The Clutters were respected in their congregation. Faith wasn't performative for them, it was lived. Prayer before meals, church attendance consistent, moral discipline woven into daily life. There were no enemies, no debts, no public conflicts. If you were building a list of families at risk, theirs wouldn't make the top 1,000. Holcomb trusted its own. Strangers stood out immediately. And there were no strangers seen that night. No suspicious vehicles parked along the road, no reports of gunshots, nothing that warned the community that history was about to split in two. When Nancy failed to show up for church events the next day, concern flickered, then grew. Friends stopped by the farmhouse. They knocked, no answer. They entered. What they found shattered the illusion forever. 4 members of the Clutter family had been murdered inside their own home. Bound, shot, no sign of struggle outside, no theft that made sense, just silence where life had been hours before. Holcomb had never experienced anything like this. The idea that someone could enter a farmhouse, move through its rooms, and leave without being heard felt impossible. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted shut. Shotguns appeared beside beds. Trust evaporated overnight, because if it could happen to the Clutters, it could happen to anyone. Investigators quickly realized something unsettling. This was not a robbery gone wrong. Very little had been taken. The house wasn't ransacked. There was no clear personal motive. Herbert Clutter was known for paying workers fairly. He had no criminal ties. The randomness of it felt worse than revenge. It suggested unpredictability. The Clutters lived by structure and faith. Their lives were organized, disciplined, predictable. Yet the violence that entered their home was chaotic, sudden, senseless. Two worlds collided in that farmhouse, and one destroyed the other. News of the murders traveled fast. Small-town tragedy became national horror because it touched something primal, the belief that rural America was safe, that good families were protected by virtue, that faith created security. The Clutter murders shattered that belief, and the question became unavoidable. Who would target a family like this, and why? At this point in the story, there were no suspects, just fear, just unanswered questions, and a town forced to confront a new reality. Evil doesn't need a reason to enter your home. It just needs opportunity. The morning after the murders, Holcomb stopped breathing. Church bells rang, but pews were filled with whispers instead of hymns. Men who'd never locked their doors now checked them twice. Women who once left windows open at night pulled curtains tight because something had changed. The illusion of safety was gone, and in its place stood a terrifying question. If this wasn't random, then who knew enough about the Clutters to do it? Investigators from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation arrived quickly. Among them was Alvin Dewey, a seasoned agent who understood one thing immediately. Crimes like this don't happen without connection. The Clutters weren't wealthy in a flashy way. They didn't carry large amounts of cash. There was no obvious reason for someone to believe a fortune was hidden inside the house. So where had that idea come from? Because evidence suggested the killers were looking for something specific, and that meant someone had told them. Word began circulating quietly. Herbert Clutter was rumored to keep a safe filled with cash inside the farmhouse, but investigators quickly learned something critical. There was no safe. Herbert paid by check. He avoided keeping large amounts of money at home, which meant the killers had acted on misinformation. That detail mattered because it narrowed the pool. Someone, somewhere, had spread that rumor. In the weeks that followed, interviews piled up. Farmhands, neighbors, delivery drivers. One name kept appearing in conversations: Floyd Wells. Wells had worked briefly for Herbert Clutter years earlier. He had served time in prison, and according to investigators, he had once mentioned the Clutter farm while incarcerated. Specifically, he had mentioned the safe that didn't exist. Now the illusion of randomness began to crack. While Kansas searched inward, two men were already moving outward, traveling south, crossing state lines, leaving behind a town that would never forget their footsteps. Their names would soon become infamous: Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. But at this stage, they were just drifters, ex-convicts with limited money, limited prospects, and a shared plan built on a lie. Before November 14th, there were hints. Hickok had spoken openly about needing money, about a big score. Smith, quiet and introspective, had a history of instability. Both had criminal records. Both had spent time behind bars, but none of those details were known in Holcomb at the time. The town didn't see warning signs because the danger wasn't local, it was mobile. In prison, Floyd Wells had casually mentioned that the Clutter farm might hold thousands in cash. He didn't know the rumor was false. He didn't know someone would take it seriously, but Hickok did. He filed it away, turned it into a plan. By the time Wells heard about the murders in the news, dread settled in, because he knew the rumor he had shared might have sparked something irreversible. Agent Dewey and his team began tracking parole records, cross-referencing recent releases, looking for men who knew Wells. The connection between Hickok and Wells surfaced. Then Smith's name followed. Suddenly, the crime wasn't random, it was targeted, but built on misinformation. And that made it worse, because the Clutters hadn't been killed for what they had. They were killed for what someone imagined they had. While investigators pieced together clues, Holcomb turned inward. Neighbors eyed each other differently. Could someone local have helped them? Could someone have tipped them off? Fear makes communities suspicious, and suspicion fractures trust faster than violence. But as evidence mounted, One thing became clear. The killers were outsiders. They came in with a plan, and they left with nothing. As witnesses were interviewed, timelines blurred. Gas station sightings, highway stops, conversations overheard. Some details aligned, others contradicted each other. But one thing stood firm. Hickok had spoken about the Clutter farm before the murders. That wasn't coincidence, it was intent. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer the pattern became. Two men desperate for money, a rumor about a safe, a farmhouse isolated enough to feel vulnerable. But something still didn't fit. If the goal was robbery, why kill everyone? That question haunted the investigation, because robbery explains intrusion, it doesn't explain execution. When Smith and Hickok were finally located and arrested in Nevada, relief washed through Kansas. But relief quickly gave way to something darker, because once interrogations began, the randomness of the crime dissolved entirely. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something else, and the motive was far more chilling than greed. The warning signs existed, just not where anyone was looking. A rumor, a prison conversation, two men searching for opportunity. Comment below, would you have noticed the warning signs, or would you have believed the Clutters were simply victims of chance? Because next, we step inside that farmhouse, and what really happened there will change everything. The road to the Clutter farm was quiet that night. No streetlights, no passing traffic. Just open land and a sky heavy with stars. Two men stepped out of a car and walked toward a house they believed held thousands of dollars. They expected resistance. They expected fear. They did not expect disappointment. And that disappointment would turn lethal. The farmhouse door was unlocked. In Holcomb, that wasn't unusual. The men moved inside carefully. They carried a shotgun, a knife, and a plan shaped by prison rumor. They were looking for a safe. They went room to room. They found none. That's when frustration replaced intention. Herbert Clutter was awakened first, confused but composed. He cooperated. He answered questions. He explained there was no safe, no stash of cash, just checks, just paperwork. The killers didn't believe him. They thought he was lying, because they had built this entire crime around a rumor, and if the rumor wasn't true, then the risk they'd taken was meaningless. The intruders bound the family members separately. Herbert in the basement, Kenyon nearby, Nancy and Bonnie upstairs. They spoke calmly, methodically. There was no chaos, no screaming heard beyond the walls. That detail would later terrify investigators because it suggested control, not panic. As the search continued, the truth became undeniable. There was no safe, no fortune, only about $40 to $50. $40 for 4 lives. The plan had collapsed, and now they faced a choice: leave witnesses or eliminate them. What happened next wasn't impulsive. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The killers decided no one could identify them. Herbert was killed first, then Kenyon. Upstairs, Bonnie and Nancy. 4 executions inside a home built on faith and routine. The killers left quietly, as if nothing had happened. No alarms rang, no neighbors stirred. The farmhouse stood in darkness, holding its secret until morning. The wheat fields outside moved with the wind, unaware that something inside the house had shifted the course of American crime history. Smith and Hickok drove off into the night. They had not found the fortune they imagined. They had not solved their financial problems. They had only added 4 murders to their names. But something else had shifted too. Later, during interrogations, accounts would reveal something chilling. One of the men admitted there had been no anger toward the Clutters, no personal hatred. In fact, there was a strange acknowledgement of Herbert's dignity, which makes the crime harder to process, because it wasn't fueled by rage, it was fueled by emptiness. When friends entered the house the next day, The normalcy of the interior felt grotesque. Beds neatly made, kitchen untouched, no sign of ransacking, just a stillness that didn't belong. The randomness dissolved. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong, it was a decision carried out after failure. The Clutter murders felt different, not because they were the most violent, but because they shattered the myth of rural invulnerability. The killers weren't driven by revenge, they weren't connected to the family, they killed strangers for money that didn't exist, and that randomness created nationwide fear. If it could happen in Holcomb, where couldn't it happen? Years later, when recounting the crime, Perry Smith would speak about Herbert Clutter with a strange tone. He claimed he thought Herbert was a very nice gentleman. He said there was no personal animosity. That detail chills investigators even now, because it reveals something disturbing. Empathy and violence can coexist in the same moment, and that's far more frightening than hatred. By the time authorities arrested the suspects, the farmhouse had become a symbol. Journalists flooded Holcomb, photographers captured the quiet exterior, writers sought meaning in something that had none. Among them was Truman Capote, whose book In Cold Blood would later immortalize the crime. But that story comes later. Right now, we are still inside the house, still standing in the silence, still trying to understand how two men crossed a threshold and decided 4 lives were disposable. The robbery failed, but the crime succeeded. And in the next chapter, the investigation uncovers something deeper than greed, something that forces a reckoning with motive, psychology, and justice. By the time Perry Smith and Richard Hickok were brought back to Kansas, the country was watching. Holcomb wanted answers. America wanted certainty. And investigators wanted confessions. The questioning did not begin with shouting. It began with patience. Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents understood something important. These men were not hardened masterminds. They were fragile, egotistical, impulsive, capable of unraveling. At first, both denied involvement. They blamed rumors, blamed bad luck, blamed coincidence. But the evidence was tightening. Travel records, witness sightings, connections to Floyd Wells. The circle was closing. Richard Hickok broke first. Not fully, not immediately, but enough. His story shifted. Details emerged that only someone inside the farmhouse would know. The bindings, the layout, the order of events. It wasn't a full confession, but it was a fracture, and fractures spread quickly under pressure. Perry Smith held out longer. He was quieter, more introspective, harder to read. But when he finally spoke, the details were unmistakable. He described Herbert Clutter, the basement, the moment of decision. There was no hysteria in his tone, no visible rage, just matter-of-fact recounting, and that chilled investigators more than denial ever could. During interrogation, one thing became clear. The motive was not personal. There had been no prior feud, no emotional grudge, just a rumor about a safe, a plan built on misinformation, and once inside the house, a realization that they had risked everything for almost nothing. The betrayal wasn't just of the Clutter family, it was of logic. Because when robbery failed, there was still a choice. They could have left. They didn't. As confessions solidified, law enforcement moved quickly. Some critics would later argue the investigation became too focused once Smith and Hickok were identified. Could there have been accomplices? Was every detail independently verified, or did relief at solving the case override deeper scrutiny? In 1959, forensic science was limited. Much of the case rested on confession, and confessions, while powerful, are not infallible. But in this case, they aligned with physical evidence, the bindings, the weapon, the timeline. Still, the speed of resolution left some uneasy. Was it clean justice? or simply a story that fit too well? The trial began in 1960. Holcomb felt smaller than ever. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Inside, the proceedings were methodical. The confessions were introduced. The brutality was outlined. The lack of motive emphasized. The defense argued psychological instability, especially in Perry Smith's case. They presented a childhood marked by trauma, abuse, isolation. But the prosecution focused on deliberation, planning, travel, execution. This was not a spontaneous act. It was premeditated. Some expected remorse. Others expected defiance. But what they witnessed instead was something more unsettling. Moments of reflection, occasional emotional distance, but no grand confession of evil, no dramatic courtroom outburst, just two men seated calmly as their fate was sealed. And that calmness disturbed the public deeply, because people prefer monsters to look monstrous. Smith and Hickok did not. Guilty. Both men were sentenced to death. The courtroom did not erupt. It absorbed the verdict in silence. Outside, Holcomb exhaled. But relief is complicated, because justice delivered does not resurrect the dead, and certainty delivered does not erase trauma. Years passed before the execution. Appeals were filed, arguments raised. The legal system moved deliberately. In 1965, both men were executed at the Kansas State Penitentiary. The state had closed the chapter legally, but culturally, it was just beginning. The Clutter murders became more than a crime. They became a narrative. Thanks in part to Truman Capote, who embedded himself in the story and later published In Cold Blood. The book blurred lines between journalism and literature, between fact and emotional interpretation. It humanized the killers in ways some found uncomfortable, and it immortalized the Clutter family in American crime history. But it also raised another question. Did the investigation get this right, or did they miss something? Because in the final chapter, we confront the aftermath, how Holcomb changed forever, how America redefined safety, and why this story still refuses to fade. Do you believe the investigators got this right, or did they miss something? Because in the final chapter, we confront the aftermath, how Holcomb changed forever, how America redefined safety, and why this story still refuses to fade. When the executions were carried out in 1965, Kansas believed the story had ended. Justice, as defined by the courts, had been delivered. Two men were dead. The Clutter family had been avenged. The farmhouse stood empty. But something inside Holcomb never returned to normal. Before November 1959, Holcomb trusted the night. After the murders, that trust vanished. Doors were locked. Lights were left on. Shotguns rested beside beds. Parents checked windows twice before sleeping. The Clutters hadn't just been murdered. A way of life had been dismantled. Because if violence could walk into that farmhouse, it could walk anywhere. The Clutter home was eventually sold, renovated, occupied by new families, but no amount of fresh paint could erase its history. For locals, it was never just a farmhouse again. It was a reminder of vulnerability, of how thin the line is between ordinary life and irreversible loss. Visitors would drive by slowly, some out of curiosity, others out of quiet respect. The land remained still, but the story attached to it would not fade. When Perry Smith and Richard Hickok were hanged at the Kansas State Penitentiary, the legal system called it justice, but justice does not equal peace. Some believe the death penalty restored moral balance. Others questioned whether executing the killers resolved anything. Did it prevent future crimes? Did it heal a grieving town? Or did it simply close a legal file? The answer depends on who you ask. The case might have remained a regional tragedy, but one man changed that. Truman Capote transformed the Clutter murders into literature. In Cold Blood became a cultural phenomenon. It introduced millions to Holcomb, to the Clutters, to Smith and Hickok. Capote's portrayal blurred lines between victim and perpetrator. He examined childhood trauma, psychology, human frailty. Some praised the nuance, others felt it humanized killers too deeply. But one thing is certain, the book ensured this story would never disappear. The Clutter murders altered how Americans thought about safety. Before 1959, violent home invasions in rural communities felt distant. Afterward, they felt possible. The crime fed into a growing national anxiety about random violence. It challenged the myth that moral virtue shields you from harm. The Clutters were disciplined, faithful, respected. None of it protected them. And that realization unsettled the nation. Even decades later, one question lingers: why kill them? If robbery was the goal and robbery failed, why not leave? Smith later spoke about feeling a strange respect for Herbert Clutter. Hickok focused more on money. Neither offered a motive that felt sufficient, which forces us to confront something darker. Sometimes violence doesn't come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from emptiness, from detachment, from the absence of moral restraint. And that is far harder to defend against. The town does not glorify the killers. It remembers the Clutters. Nancy's kindness, Kenyon's quiet creativity, Herbert's discipline, Bonnie's fragile resilience. In small towns, memory lives in stories, passed from one generation to the next, but always carefully, because remembering is painful and forgetting feels wrong. The Clutter murders became a blueprint for modern true crime storytelling, psychological exploration, narrative immersion, empathy mixed with horror. But the deeper legacy is this: it reminded audiences that crime is not always complex. Sometimes it is terrifyingly simple. Two men believed a rumor, they acted on it, and 4 people died. There was no conspiracy, no elaborate cover-up, no hidden network, just opportunity and choice. And that's what makes this story linger, because it suggests safety is fragile, routine is fragile, life itself is fragile. Imagine the Clutters preparing for church, the house quiet, shoes by the door, faith steady. They could not have known what the night would bring. They could not have imagined their home would become a cautionary tale. And yet, in a single evening, everything changed. The family left home that night believing tomorrow would come as it always had. But sometimes, tomorrow never arrives. And sometimes, evil doesn't need a reason. It only needs a door.